Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases in New Orleans history. Before we start, please tell me in the comments where you're watching this and what time it is where you are. We want to know where and when these stories are read. The disappearance happened in 1844. The Rousseau family had one of the most respected homes in the French Quarter of New Orleans, where the Mississippi River curved like a crescent moon. Their three-story house on Bourbon Street, with its wrought iron balconies and courtyard fountain, was a sign of the wealth that had come from the sugar trade for generations. On the evening of September 12th, Julian Rousseau was last seen with a free woman of color named Celestine Hartwell. By morning, neither could be found. The search that followed would reveal a number of rooms with no doors, hallways that led nowhere, and a secret that the most powerful families in Louisiana had worked together to keep hidden for decades. The one thing that puzzled investigators from the start was the single woman's satin evening slipper found in the middle of Royal Street, 3 blocks from the Rousseau home. There were no signs of a fight or violence on it. It was just left behind, as if the person who owned it had disappeared into the thick southern air. The handkerchief found nearby was even more interesting. It had the initials J.R. on it, and was not stained with blood, as one might expect, but with what looked like candle wax and what was later found to be river clay. How did these things get so far away from where the couple was last seen? And why did 6 different people say they heard a woman singing from inside the sealed wall of St. Louis Cathedral that same night? The Rousseau family had been in the area since the first French settlers arrived. Julian's grandfather, Gore Rousseau, came to Louisiana in 1724 with nothing but a dream. By 1750, he had built a successful business that sent sugar, cotton, and indigo back to France. The family's wealth grew along with the city, and they had a say in banking, real estate, and local politics. In 1844, the Rousseaus were one of the richest families in New Orleans. Their name was linked to old money and even older power. Julian was the only son and heir. He was 26 years old, went to school in Paris, and had just come back to take over the family business. People who knew him said he was a serious young man who was methodical in his habits and kept to himself. He wasn't very good-looking or charming, but his family name and wealth made him one of the most eligible bachelors in New Orleans. Julian was going to marry Margaret Wilkinson, the daughter of a well-known cotton broker, in the spring of 1845. According to letters between family members that are kept at the Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane University, Celestine Hartwell's picture was more complicated. In 1820, she was born to a French merchant and a free woman of color. In antebellum New Orleans, she was a gens de couleur libres, or free person of color. According to records, she ran a small hat shop on Conti Street that served both wealthy white and colored customers. When she was 16, her mother died, leaving her the business and a small house near Rampart Street. Everyone agrees that Celestine was very beautiful, spoke well, and could read and write in both English and French. The official record doesn't say how she met Julian Rousseau. The last people to see them were the household staff, who told us that Julian had a visitor shortly after 8 o'clock on September 12th. Thomas Wells, the butler, led in a woman who was wearing a dark blue dress and matching bonnet. She asked to talk to Monsieur Rousseau about a business matter. Wells led her to the small parlor and told his master that she was there. Wells told the police on September 14 that Julian looked surprised but not angry. He told Wells to bring a tray of sherry and make sure they wouldn't be disturbed. Mary Sullivan, the housekeeper, heard low voices talking in what she called intense but not angry conversation as she walked by the closed parlor door around 10:30 that night. She saw that a lamp was still on in the room, which could be seen through the crack under the door. The household staff last saw Julian Rousseau or Celestine Hartwell at this time. The parlor was empty by morning. There was only an inch of liquid in the sherry decanter. There were 2 glasses used. The lamp had run out of oil and burned out. There were no signs of a fight, and there was no proof that someone had broken in or out. Julian and Celestine had both just disappeared. At first, the Rousseau family thought it was a private matter. Julian's dad, Etienne Rousseau, asked the staff questions, but didn't tell the police right away. The disappearance of Julian became more widely known only after Margaret Wilkinson's family asked about his absence from a planned lunch on September 13th. If a street vendor hadn't found Julian's handkerchief and Celestine's shoe on Royal Street early on September 14, the family might have kept things quiet. The City Watch got the items and saw the Russo monogram right away. They then told the family right away. At this point, Etienne Russo reluctantly filed a report about a missing person. The government had started looking for Julian and Celestine, but what came out of that search was much more troubling than a simple disappearance. A web of relationships, grudges, and rituals that went back decades before either Julian or Celestine was born. The Russo house was built on land that used to be part of the Treme plantation. Municipal records say that before that, it was home to a small group of Choctaw Indians. Some people said the ground was sacred, while others said it was cursed. It is known that workers found a mass grave with the bodies of at least 15 people while building the Russo home in 1791. The find was quickly hidden, both in the real world and in the news. The building went on, and the only record of the event was in the private journal of the architect, François Latour. No one found it until 1963, when it was discovered during renovations to the Cabildo. There were no major changes in the first month after the disappearance. The City Watch did quick interviews with the household staff, business partners, and friends of both missing people. Celestine's hat shop stayed closed, and the items in it were not disturbed. Julian's personal things, like his pocket watch, letters, and business documents, stayed in his bedroom. There were no strange withdrawals from the Russo accounts at the Bank of Louisiana. It was like neither side had planned for a long absence. If it weren't for the determination of one person, Father Antoine Mandelli, an Italian-born priest who worked at St. Louis Cathedral, the case might have completely faded from public view. Father Mandelli had gotten to know Celestine because she went to early morning mass every week. Mandelli wrote to Bishop Antoine Blanc on the 22nd of October 1844 to say that she was worried about Celestine's disappearance. She said that Celestine was a woman of real faith and steady habits who didn't act on impulse or get involved in intrigue. He asked for permission to ask his parishioners questions and pray for her safe return. Father Mandelli's unofficial investigation led to the creation of a small book called Notes on a Disappearance. He never published it, but the diocese archives still have it. He learned about Celestine's life in the weeks before she went missing by talking to her neighbors and clients. Several sources say that Celestine had been getting more and more anxious over the summer of 1844. People had seen her talking to an older woman known as Madame Laveau many times. This woman may be related to the more famous Marie Laveau, but this has not been proven. More importantly, Father Mandelli found proof that Celestine and the Russo family had known each other for a long time. He wrote about a baptismal record from St. Louis Cathedral that was dated the 3rd of April, 1820. In his notes, the entry said that Celestine, the daughter of François Hartwell, and Dominique, a free woman of color, had been baptized. Mandelli was interested in the name of the godfather, Gore Russo, who was Julian's grandfather. This link made it seem like the families had been connected for more than 20 years before the person went missing. Father Mandelli might have been able to keep asking questions if he hadn't had an unexpected visitor at his small room behind the cathedral. On the night of November 9th, Etienne Russo himself went to see the priest. Mandelli's journal entry from that night says that the conversation was short but to the point. Russo thanked the priest for his concern but said that looking into it more would only hurt both families. He hinted that his son and Miss Hartwell had probably run away to France or Cuba and that it would be best for everyone if they kept quiet. He made a large donation to the cathedral's restoration fund before he left. Father Mandelli said that the $500 was exactly what was needed to finish fixing the north wall of the cathedral, where workers had recently heard strange noises at night. After this visit, the case didn't get as much attention from officials. The City Watch stopped looking into the case in December because they didn't find any evidence of wrongdoing. The Picayune ran a short article saying that Julian Russo had been seen getting on a ship going to Marseille, but no passenger list ever confirmed this. Celestine sold her hat shop to pay off some debts that weren't made clear. By the beginning of 1845, it looked like the mystery would never be solved, adding another strange chapter to the complicated social history of New Orleans. But there were other things going on under the surface of public record. A fire broke out in the Russo home in January 1845, It destroyed part of the east wing, including the parlor where Julian and Celestine had last been seen. The damage was kept from spreading to the main building, but the timing made people who were still following the case wonder. The discovery made during reconstruction was even more interesting. Workers found a secret door behind what looked like a solid bookcase. The door opened onto a narrow hallway that led to a small room with no windows. The room only had one chair and an oil lamp on the wall. The builder's report noted the discovery, but it didn't get much attention until 1861, when the Russo home was taken over by the Confederate Army to be used as officers' quarters during the Civil War. Lieutenant James Metcalf from Virginia was in charge of cataloging the property's contents. He found the hidden room and wrote about a strange smell that was not unpleasant but different, like church incense mixed with river mud. He also saw scratches on the inside of the hidden door, which could have been made by someone trying to get out. Metcalf's report was put away with hundreds of other similar reports and stayed hidden in military archives for almost 100 years. The Russo family stayed important in New Orleans society throughout the 1,850 seconds, but their power slowly faded. In 1853, Etienne died, and his son-in-law Thomas Beaumont, who had married Julian's sister, Marie Claire, took over the family businesses. The family's story about Julian became a vague one, about how he moved to Europe after a relationship that didn't work out. There was never any communication from him, and there was no proof that he was in France or anywhere else. He was like a ghost, showing up in family pictures that still hung in the main hall but not in anyone's memory. Celestine Hartwell disappeared even more completely from the public record. There were no census records, tax records, or parish registers with her name after 1840. It was like the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. The only proof that she had ever walked the cobblestones of New Orleans was a satin slipper left behind on Royal Street. The years went by. The Civil War changed the way people lived in New Orleans and all of Louisiana. The Russo fortune, which was closely linked to slavery, went down a lot, but didn't go away completely. They still owned the family home, but they sold parts of it to pay off debts. During the 1845 reconstruction, a hidden room was found. It was sealed up again during renovations in 1872, but this time it was done better. They built a new wall that was thicker than the old one, and the space was added to the kitchen area, which is now bigger. If anyone in the family knew why this building choice was important, they didn't leave any proof of it. In 1891, almost 50 years after the disappearance, an old woman named Sarah Johnson talked to a reporter from the Times-Democrat who was gathering stories about New Orleans before the Civil War. From 1838 until emancipation, Johnson worked as a laundress for several well-known families, such as the Russos. She talked about a night in September 1844 when she was coming home late from delivering clean linens to the Wilkinsons. Around midnight, she drove by the Russo property and saw two people in the garden, a man and a woman who looked like they were having a serious talk. She recognized the man as Julian Russo, and he was making strong gestures while the woman stood perfectly still with her back to Johnson. They were standing close to the old well, which had been covered up years ago but still looked nice in the garden. People might have thought Johnson's story was just the confused memories of an old woman if it hadn't had one detail that matched up with physical evidence found decades later. She said that Julian kept pointing to a certain brick in the garden wall that looked darker than the other bricks around it. This detail would be important when a part of that same garden wall fell down during a bad storm in 1927, revealing a small hole with a metal box inside. Workers fixing the wall found the box, which was badly rusted but still whole. There was a leather-bound journal inside, but most of the pages were ruined by time and moisture. Only parts of the text were still readable, but one of them was a passage from the 10th of September, 1844, written in Julian Russo's handwriting, which experts would later confirm. The passage said, "C has confirmed what I have long suspected. The basement room beneath the east parlor connects to the old tunnel." Father must be confronted with this knowledge, though I fear his reaction. The documents C, found in her mother's things, leave no doubt about what happened in 1820. Tomorrow, I will speak with him directly. What events from 1820 could Julian have been talking about? Historical records show that this year was important for New Orleans because of a yellow fever outbreak that killed almost 2,000 people, the first steamship voyage up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico, and stricter laws that controlled the actions of free people of color. Baptismal records also say that Celestine Hartwell was born in that year. The links between these facts were weak until 1959, when digging for a new sewer line along Bourbon Street uncovered a section of tunnel that had never been seen before, about 9 feet below street level. The tunnel was about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, and it went almost 30 yards before it collapsed, making it impossible to explore further. City engineers found that it used to connect to the basement of what was then the Rousseau property, which had been turned into a hotel. The way the tunnel was built put it at around 1,810 to 1,820, which was when Julian's grandfather, Gore Rousseau, was at the height of his power and influence. The discovery reignited interest in the long-forgotten disappearance. Martha Gallagher, a graduate student at Tulane University, wrote her thesis in historical anthropology about the Rousseau-Hartwell case. Gallagher put together the most complete account of what happened on the 12th of September, 1844, by carefully looking through municipal archives, church records, and private collections. Her work, which was finished in 1962 but never published for sale, suggested a story that was much more complicated and disturbing than a simple elopement or even a normal murder. Gallagher's research shows that the Rousseau and Hartwell families have been connected since Celestine was born, and probably even before that. It was strange for a man of Gore Rousseau's status to be the godfather at her baptism, especially since she was the child of a free woman of color. Gallagher found proof in notarial records that Dominique Hartwell, Celestine's mother, had been owned by the Rousseau family before being set free in 1817. There is no record of how this manumission happened, but Gallagher did note a large money transfer between Gore Rousseau and Francois Hartwell, Celestine's father, that took place 3 months before Dominique's freedom was secured. Gallagher's discovery of a series of payments from the Rousseau family to Dominique Hartwell, which started in 1820 and continued until her death in 1836, was even more revealing. The payments, which were kept in Gore Rousseau's private ledger and are now in the historic New Orleans collection, were large, $50 every 3 months, which was a lot of money for a skilled tradesman to make in a year. The ledger had the payments listed under the heading Maintenance of Family Obligations, which Gore used in other places to mean real family expenses. It was clear what they meant, but it was still just a guess. Celestine Hartwell was most likely Gore Rousseau's biological daughter. This would have made her Julian's aunt, even though they were only 6 years apart in age. These kinds of arrangements were common in antebellum New Orleans, where wealthy white men often had second families with free women of color. They sometimes took care of their mixed-race children in secret ways and never publicly acknowledged them. The Rousseau-Hartwell case was different because it seemed like this unspoken social compact had broken down. Gallagher's thesis posited that Celestine had uncovered documentation regarding her parentage, potentially through materials bequeathed by her mother, and subsequently presented this information to Julian. It is not clear if this approach was driven by a need for recognition, money, or some kind of justice. The subsequent events transition from historical documentation to conjecture, although Gallagher's meticulous research presents various persuasive scenarios. The tunnel that connected the Rousseau basement to a point several blocks away gave Julian and Celestine a way to leave the house without being seen. The end of the tunnel was near the Mississippi riverfront on the night of September 12. Many boats docked there every day, giving people a way to get out of the city. But if they had planned to run away together, why was Celestine's slipper found on Royal Street in the opposite direction? And why would Julian have left behind all of his personal belongings, including things he needed for travel? Gallagher's study of Etienne Rousseau's actions in the days after the disappearance led to a different theory. On September 13, the day after Julian and Celestine went missing, bank records showed an unusual withdrawal of $3,000, which was a lot of money in 1844. The next day, Etienne met with Judge William Harper in private. Harper had known the Rousseau family for a long time and had financial ties to them. 3 days later, the city watch officer who was first given the job of looking into the disappearance was moved to patrol duty in the Tremé district, which is far from the French Quarter. While these circumstances were not conclusive, they did point to a deliberate attempt to change the official response to the disappearance. It's not clear from the evidence whether Etienne was protecting his son from scandal, covering up a crime that he or someone else committed, or carrying out a more evil plan of his own. Gallagher was able to find out through property records that Etienne Rousseau bought a small piece of land in Street Bernard Parish on the 20th of September 1844, just over a week after the person went missing. The land was in a remote area near Bayou Country and only had an old sugar mill on it. After Etienne died in 1853, the property was sold. He never developed it. There is no record of any investigation of the site in connection with the disappearance. Gallagher found the most disturbing evidence in an unexpected place: the personal diary of Julian's fiancée, Margaret Wilkinson. Wilkinson's descendants kept the diary, and Gallagher was able to read it thanks to a lucky family connection. The entries in the diary went from January 1844 to December 1845. The entry from September 10, 2 days before Julian went missing, talked about a troubling conversation with him. Margaret wrote, "Jay called today in a state of great agitation. He spoke at length about family legacy and blood relations, much of it incomprehensible. He mentioned a woman named Celestine, saying she possessed documents that would bring down the house of Rousseau. When I pressed for explanation, he became evasive, apologized for his manner, and departed abruptly. I fear his time in Paris has unsettled his mind." This entry aligned with the fragment found in Julian's journal, referring to Document C, discovered, and his intention to confront his father. It implied that whatever Celestine had learned, Julian thought it was believable and scary enough to be a threat to his family's position. The essence of this information, aside from the probable truth of Celestine's lineage, constitutes the principal enigma of the case. Gallagher's thesis offered multiple possibilities, each bolstered by partial evidence, yet none conclusively established. The simplest explanation was that Celestine had found out that Gore Rousseau was her biological father and that he had kept her mother Dominique in a relationship that was not fully consensual, even though she was technically a free woman. If this information were to get out, especially if it were written down, it could hurt the Rousseau family's reputation in New Orleans and possibly lead to legal problems. Gallagher's study of the tunnel that connected the Rousseau basement to the riverfront brought up a more complicated possibility. City records showed that similar tunnels had been found under other properties owned by wealthy families with ties to the transatlantic trade. Some historical evidence suggests that these tunnels were used not only to smuggle goods to avoid paying Spanish and later American customs duties, but also to secretly move people, enslaved people who were brought into Louisiana during times when the legal trade was limited. Gore Rousseau kept very good records of his legal businesses, but there were clear gaps in them during certain times, between 1810 and 1820, especially when it came to transactions involving ships coming from Cuba and Brazil. During these times, he was able to buy a lot more plantations and hire a lot more slaves to work on them. If Gore had been involved in illegal slave trading during this time, and Celestine had found proof of this, the family's problems would have gone beyond social embarrassment to possible criminal charges and financial ruin. Gallagher put forward the most troubling theory, which she handled with the right amount of academic caution. It was about the mass grave that was found while building the Rousseau home in 1791. The Architect's Journal, which was found during the 1963 renovations to the Cabildo, said that the remains were arranged in a way that suggested they were meant for a ceremony rather than just being thrown away. The journal said that Gore Rousseau had personally overseen the reburial of the remains in an unknown place and had threatened the workers with both money and threats to keep quiet. If Celestine had somehow found out that her biological father was involved with these remains and how they were treated, it might explain why her approach seemed to make people so angry. It might also explain the secret room behind the bookcase, the tunnel that goes to the river, and the piece of land that Etienne Rousseau bought after the person went missing. Each of these elements indicated not merely the concealment of a crime, but a systematic infrastructure for activities that required discretion from public scrutiny. Martha Gallagher's thesis was turned in June 1962, and her academic advisors were very impressed with it. People told her to turn the work into a book that could be sold. In September of that year, she went to Street Bernard Parish to look into the property that Etienne Rousseau bought after he went missing. According to parish records, she got permission to do a preliminary archaeological survey of the site. Robert Kleinman, a graduate student in archaeology, went with her. Gallagher and Kleinman did not come back from this trip. Someone found their car parked near the property. Local authorities searched for a long time, but never found any sign of either researcher. For 7 years, the investigation into their disappearance stayed open before being closed. At that time, Gallagher's thesis materials were collected as possible evidence and then sealed as part of the ongoing investigation. When the case was finally closed in 1969, her research was moved to the university archives. However, it was still kept secret because of a legal agreement between the university and an unnamed third party. Researchers were finally able to see her work in 2004 thanks to a Freedom of Information Act request. However, some parts that dealt with certain land records in St. Bernard Parish were still blacked out for reasons that were never made public. Since Gallagher went missing, historians, paranormal investigators, and true crime fans have paid sporadic attention to the Russo Hartwell case. In the 1,980 seconds, the Russo home was turned into a small hotel that took advantage of the property's haunted reputation. It had been owned by different people over the years. Sometimes, guests hear strange noises coming from the walls, especially in rooms that were built over what used to be the East Wing. During renovations in 1997, workers said they found a sealed cavity with a woman's slipper inside, like the one found on Royal Street in 1844. However, there was no physical evidence to back up this claim. New buildings have taken the place of the millinery shop that Celestine Hartwell used to own on Conti Street. A historical marker put up in 2008 recognizes her as one of the entrepreneurial free women of color who helped shape New Orleans' unique culture. However, the marker doesn't say anything about her disappearance or her connection to the Russo family. Hurricane Katrina caused a lot of damage to St. Bernard Parish, including the land that Etienne Rousseau owned for a short time. The old sugar mill that had been on the site for more than 150 years was completely destroyed. After the storm, while crews were cleaning up the mess, a local resident said they found a small metal object that looked like a key with the letter R on it. The item was given to the parish authorities, but it disappeared from the evidence room before it could be properly examined or confirmed. It is likely that we will never know for sure what really happened to Julian Russo and Celestine Hartwell on the 12th of September 1844. Most of the physical evidence has been lost to time, deliberate destruction, and natural disasters. The written record is still incomplete, and a lot of it is biased and limited by the time period. What we have left is a picture in negative space, the outlines of two lives, and the strong social forces that seem to have worked together to erase them. One of the most interesting things about the case is how quickly people forgot about it at the time. Even though it involved a well-known family and strange circumstances, the disappearance got very little coverage in the news and very little official response. This silence shows how things worked in antebellum New Orleans, where some questions couldn't be asked, some connections couldn't be made, and some truths couldn't be spoken out loud. But the story won't go away completely. It lives on in bits of journals, strange buildings, and oral histories that have been passed down from generation to generation in New Orleans. It endures through the relentless inquiries posed by researchers such as Martha Gallagher, who simultaneously become integral to the enigma. It endures primarily in the uneasy realm between historical fact and conjecture, in the liminal space where documented evidence confronts the boundaries of societal acknowledgement regarding its own history. In the end, maybe the best way to remember Julian Russo and Celestine Hartwell is not with a historical marker or an academic thesis, but with the echo of their absence. A silence that has become more powerful than words over time. In the city built on stories, theirs is still not finished. It's a story thread that goes into darkness and never comes back. People who listen carefully can still hear that silence coming from New Orleans' hidden rooms, sealed tunnels, and unmarked graves. It tells the story of what happens when powerful men decide that some truths should never be known. The sound of their feet on cobblestones has long since faded away. It has been more than 150 years since the candlelight that lit up their last known conversation went out. But in the city's collective memory, something remains. A shadow on the wall, a whisper in the courtyard, and the faint outline of a slipper left behind on Royal Street, waiting for its owner to come back and get it. She never did. In 1968, Eleanor Whitfield, a retired librarian, found something while sorting through a collection of personal papers given to the Louisiana Historical Society. This was almost a century and a quarter after the papers had gone missing. A thin book bound in faded red leather was among the things that belonged to the Beaumont family, who are the descendants of Marie Claire Rousseau and her husband Thomas. Marie Claire kept household accounts in the book from 1843 to 1845. Most of the entries were boring, like buying fabric, paying servants, and throwing parties. But one entry from the 13th of September, 1844, the day after Julian and Celestine went missing, stood out because it was so mysterious. Payment to Dr. Vernon for night services and discretion, $150. The large amount, which was equal to several months' wages for a skilled worker, suggested that the services were more than just routine medical care. Whitfield found out through more research that Dr. James Vernon was not mainly a doctor for the living. What he did most of the time was get bodies ready for burial, which is what a mortician does now. It was troubling that the Rousseau family would call such a professional in the middle of the night and pay him a lot of money to keep quiet. This made people wonder what really happened on September 12th. If Whitfield hadn't had a stroke shortly after writing down her findings, her discovery might have led to a new investigation into the case. 3 weeks later, she died, leaving her notes incomplete and messy. The red leather book was put back in the Beaumont collection, where it stayed uncatalogued for another 10 years because the Historical Society didn't have enough staff. In the late 1972, when the collection was finally processed, the account book was listed in the inventory, but no one knew how important it was. The mention of Dr. Vernon was lost, among hundreds of other similar entries, and once again, the connection to the Rousseau-Hartwell disappearance was lost to institutional oversight. This pattern of evidence appearing for a short time and then disappearing again has been a part of the case since the beginning. It doesn't seem like a supernatural curse, as local ghost tours might suggest. Instead, it suggests something that might be more disturbing: a social mechanism that works to hide certain kinds of historical truth. Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell went missing at the intersection of race, class, family, and power, in a society that tried to keep these categories separate. Any real investigation could have revealed not only the wrongdoing of individuals, but also how the system works. In 1982, when St. Louis Cathedral was being renovated, workers found a small hole in the north wall. This was the same wall that Father Mandeli had tried to get money to fix in 1844. There was a tarnished silver locket inside that held a small picture of a young woman whose features looked like they were from both Europe and Africa. "CH, until we meet in a better world," was written on the back. Cathedral records say that the Archdiocese received the find, but researchers have not been able to find the item in diocesan archives after looking for it. A representative from the church said in 2012 that there is no record of such an object ever being found. The years went by. New Orleans has been through both weather and social storms. The French Quarter, which used to be home to families like the Rousseaus, became a tourist spot where the city's complicated history was both celebrated and cleaned up for the masses. Ghost tours went by the Rousseau home, but the stories the guides told were often very different from what the evidence showed. People thought of Julian and Celestine as tragic lovers whose relationship went against the rules of their time. This story was easier to accept than the idea that their disappearance meant something much worse about the society that made them. Darius Washington, a graduate student in forensic anthropology at Tulane University, did a modern study of the limited physical evidence in the case in 2015. He used photos and descriptions of things that had long since disappeared. Washington used modern methods on old materials. The Journal of Forensic Anthropology published his findings, which showed that the river clay on Julian's handkerchief came from a very specific area, a section of riverbank near what used to be a private docking facility owned by the Rousseau family. This place was less than a quarter mile from where the underground tunnel that was found in 1959 would have come out. Washington's research also looked at the architectural plans for the Rousseau home, comparing the original blueprints to the plans for later renovations. He found that the basement level was different in size before and after 1845, the year the fire damaged the east wing. The plans for the basement after the fire showed that the eastern wall was about 15 feet shorter than it was in the original design. This suggests that some of the underground space was intentionally sealed off during the reconstruction. This sealed area would have been directly linked to the tunnel that led to the river. Most importantly, Washington looked at the incomplete journal entry that was found in the metal box in 1927. He was able to get back parts of text that were thought to be unreadable by using digital enhancement techniques. One of the pieces that were found was a partial sentence. "Grandfather's involvement in the rituals beneath the house must be exposed, regardless of the cost to our family name." This intriguing reference matched the architect's journal description of the mass grave, found during construction as having a ceremonial arrangement. Washington's work was the most important step forward in understanding the case since Martha Gallagher's failed research in the 1960 seconds. Washington did not try to visit the St. Bernard Parish property like Gallagher did. Instead, he focused on looking at historical records and other evidence that still exists. His research did not reach conclusive determinations regarding the outcomes for Julian and Celestine, instead offering various scenarios that align with the existing evidence. In the most innocent way of looking at it, Julian and Celestine, who may be half-siblings because of their connection to Gore Rousseau, left New Orleans together after Julian's fight with his father showed that the family didn't want to admit their relationship. They ran away through the tunnel to the river, where a boat was waiting to take them to a new life. The things found on Royal Street were put there to throw off searchers, and the payment to Dr. Vernon was for something else. In this case, they lived their lives in secret, maybe in a northern state or another country where their relationship wouldn't be looked at too closely. A more likely and darker possibility, given the evidence of quick hiding and paid secrecy, is that either Julian or Celestine, or both, were hurt on the night of September 12. The tunnel didn't lead to freedom. It was a way to get rid of evidence from the Rousseau home. The property in St. Bernard Parish, which was bought just days after the person went missing, was a good place to get rid of the body. The money paid to Dr. Vernon was not for regular medical care, but for the careful handling of a body or bodies. 3 months later, a fire that conveniently destroyed the east wing of the house got rid of any physical evidence that was still there at the main scene. The most troubling thing is that their disappearance could be linked to the rituals beneath the house that Julian wrote about in his journal. The mass grave found during construction, the tunnel system that connects important homes to the riverfront, and the authorities' careful silence all point to practices that are more organized and long-lasting than random acts of violence. If Julian had found proof that his grandfather was involved in these things, and if Celestine had more proof from papers she got from her mother, they might have threatened to tell not only family secrets, but also crimes involving several well-known people. In this context, their disappearance seems less like a personal tragedy and more like an act of self-preservation by the institution, which is trying to keep itself from being exposed. The swift conclusion of the official investigation, the family's fabrication of a false narrative regarding Julian's relocation to France, and the physical sealing of areas associated with the events all indicate a deliberate strategy aimed at obliterating not only two individuals, but also the inquiries their existence provoked regarding the society itself. Washington's research was methodologically sound, but it ran into many of the same problems that had stopped other investigations in the past. Important papers were still missing or hard to get to. There was no longer any physical evidence. Witnesses had been dead for a long time. Hurricane Katrina had already destroyed the St. Bernard Parish property, which may have had forensic evidence. Over the years, the original Rousseau home had been changed so much that it didn't look much like it did when it was built. What was left was a group of suggestive facts that revolved around a lack: the documented absence of two people who had lived, worked, and walked the streets of New Orleans. In October 2019, a member of the Beaumont family gave access to a collection of letters that had never been published before. These letters were written by Marie Claire Rousseau to her daughter Elise between 1860 and 1870. Marie Claire wrote a letter on the 12th of March, 1867, in which she made a vague reference to her brother. Today would have been Julian's 50th birthday. "I still dream of him sometimes, standing by the old well in the garden, trying to tell me something I cannot quite hear. Father took the truth of that night to his grave. and perhaps it is better so. Some burdens are too heavy for the next generation to carry. This is the only time Julien is mentioned in all of Marie Claire's surviving letters, which suggests she thought he was dead, not living abroad. More importantly, it suggests that Etienne Rousseau had clear knowledge of what happened in September 1844, but never told anyone, not even his other children. The mention of the garden fits well with Sarah Johnson's story about seeing Julien and a woman near that spot on the night he went missing, which makes her testimony more believable. Another piece of evidence found in 2021 shows the well itself. While working on a routine digitization project, archivists at the Historic New Orleans Collection came across an invoice from a construction company dated October 1844. The invoice charged Etienne Rousseau for filling and sealing of garden well with additional reinforcement as specified. The work, which was done just weeks after the disappearance, involved not just covering the well, but filling it completely with a mixture of crushed stone, lime, and cement. This was an unusually thorough and permanent way to shut down what had been a working water source for the household. The fact that Marie Claire saw Julien by the well, Sarah Johnson saw the couple in the same place, and the structure was permanently sealed afterward, all point to the garden well as a very important place in the case. Still, no investigation ever looked into this place. Historians didn't realize how important it could be until after the well had been sealed for more than 150 years, and the property had been remodeled several times, which probably destroyed any remaining evidence. The Rousseau-Hartwell case shows how time can make even important historical events hard to remember. As time goes on, memories fade, records get lost, and places change. The evidence landscape deteriorates, leaving behind insufficient elements to substantiate conclusive findings. This erosion is not often neutral or random. It often follows patterns that protect some interests while putting others at risk. Like in many other places, the stories that live on in New Orleans are often the ones that powerful families and institutions let live on. What happened to Celestine Hartwell and Julien Rousseau on the 12th of September, 1844? Based on the collection of bits of evidence over almost 200 years, the most likely scenario is that they died that night or soon after. Dr. Vernon helped them get rid of their bodies, which may have been buried or hidden on the remote property in Street Bernard Parish. The information they had found about Gore Rousseau's activities was almost certainly what led to their deaths. It was so dangerous that extreme measures had to be taken to keep it from getting out. The family's actions after the fact, sealing off parts of the house, filling in the well, making up a story about Julien's move, and making sure that Celestine's name didn't appear in public records, all point to a deliberate effort to erase not only the event, but also the questions it raised. Even though this erasure happened, there are still signs. A handkerchief on Royal Street, a slipper found decades later in a sealed wall, a hidden tunnel leading to the river, a journal fragment mentioning rituals beneath the house, a payment for night services in secrecy, a locket with the initials C, H, and a well filled with stone and lime. When put together, these pieces make a shape that, even though it's not complete, hints at something more planned than a crime of passion or a failed elopement. They point to a planned response to a perceived threat, the threat of being found out. What was so dangerous about the truth that two people had to go missing and a complicated false story had to be made up? There are a few possible explanations based on the historical context. Illegal slave trading during a time of restriction. Exploitation of women who were legally free but were actually limited by social and economic forces or ritualistic practices related to the mass grave found during construction. It could also be a mix of these things. No matter what this truth was, it involved not only Gore and Etienne Rousseau, but also possibly other well-known families who were connected to their business and social circles. From this point of view, the disappearance of Julien and Celestine is not only a personal tragedy, but also a time when the process of historical erasure can be seen in action. It shows us how power can hide inconvenient truths, how physical spaces can be changed to get rid of evidence, how official records can be changed to support preferred stories, and how social pressure can stop people from asking uncomfortable questions. Most troublingly, it shows how these systems can work without a clear conspiracy. Individuals acting to protect family interests, institutions maintaining their power, and social norms enforcing their limits can all work together to create a silence that lasts for centuries. Martha Gallagher's unpublished notes, which were found among her things after she went missing, may have the last word on the case. She wrote, "The most effective erasure is not the destruction of evidence, but the destruction of the question itself, the cultivation of a social environment where certain inquiries are simply not made, where certain connections are not drawn, where certain possibilities are not articulated." In New Orleans, of 1,844, the questions that could have revealed the truth about Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell were questions that could not be asked within the framework of the society itself. This silence was not an anomaly. It was an inherent aspect of the system operating as intended. Gallagher's insight pertains not only to antebellum New Orleans, but also to our contemporary engagement with challenging historical realities. Julian and Celestine's disappearance happened at the crossroads of racial hierarchy, family power, economic interest, and social convention. The methods that hid their fate, selective documentation, physical concealment, narrative construction, and institutional pressure, still affect which parts of our past are visible and which ones are lost to time. In this way, their story isn't over, isn't fully told, or isn't fully heard. It continues to unfold whenever we confront the gaps in our historical record and recognize them not as neutral absences, but as silences with their own complex histories, histories that speak volumes about what societies choose to remember and what they work to forget. Two people went missing from a house in New Orleans on the 12th of September, 1844. Their absence still echoes through history nearly 200 years later, and no one field, neither history nor archaeology, forensic science nor archival research, can fully answer the questions that arise. Their story lives on in the margins of documents, in the oddities of architecture, and in the contradictions of family stories. It stays because erasure is never complete, no matter how methodical it is. There is always something left behind. A handkerchief, a slipper, a piece of text, or a record of payment. And as long as these pieces are around, the questions they bring up will keep bothering the carefully made silences of history. In a city built on stories, the story of Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell that hasn't been told yet may be the most powerful of all. It is a story defined by what is missing, what is erased, and what is left out on purpose. Once we learn to hear those silences, they speak with a clarity that no written record could ever match. They tell us not only about two people who went missing one night in September, but also about the society that made their disappearance possible and then worked hard to forget them. In this selective, strategic, and long-term forgetting, we can see how history works, sorting people's lives into those that should be remembered and those that should be forgotten. But strangely, silence can also be a kind of testimony. The attempt to erase Julian and Celestine has kept them alive in a different way, as a question that can't be answered, a story that can't be finished, and a truth that won't stay hidden. In their absence, they have become more present than many of their contemporaries whose lives left fuller traces in the historical record. They continue to exist precisely due to the effort invested in their eradication. Maybe this persistence is the closest thing to justice they will ever get. Not the end of their case or the final proof of what happened, but the simple fact that powerful people worked to erase them, and that, even though they tried, they are still here, still asking questions, and still disturbing comfortable stories about the past. In a society where forgetting is forced, remembering itself becomes a way to fight back. And so we remember Julian and Celestine not as the people they were, but as the questions they became. These questions still echo through the hidden rooms, sealed tunnels, and filled-in wells of New Orleans, showing what happens when the truth is too dangerous to face. The sound of their footsteps on the cobblestones has long since stopped. It has been more than 150 years since the candlelight that lit up their last known conversation went out. But in the city's memory, which has forgotten them, there is still something. A shadow on the wall, a whisper in the courtyard, and the faint trace of a slipper left behind on Royal Street, waiting for its owner to come back and get it. She never did. In that unclaimed slipper, that unfinished journey, and that interrupted life, we see not only the story of one woman and one man in 19th century New Orleans, but also All the stories our society has decided are too dangerous to remember. It also reminds us that no erasure, no matter how thorough, can ever be complete.